Okay, so let me just check that we're going live. Okay, and we're now live. So good morning, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us in our PAASE webinars. To start us off, I'd like to call on the President of PAASE, Dr. Mario Santo Domingo, to give the opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening from Baltimore. Welcome to the 20th webinar of PAASE for this year. So this is the 20th. It's only the 9th month of the year, so we're holding more than 2 webinars a month. And we are also holding fireside chats, which are more issues and action-oriented. So I'd like to thank Dr. Raymond Tan. This is actually his second time that he's delivering a webinar. And of course, our team from De La Salle University, led by Dean Kay Aviso. So thank you very much. I'd like to invite everyone to our webinar and the fireside chat this month. We have a webinar next week entitled First Do No Harm, Food Safety Matters in Nutrition, to be given by Dr. Cecilia Cristina S. Acuin, an adjunct associate professor from the Institute of Human Nutrition and Food, UPLB. And on the 30th of September, for those who are interested in the issues of representation and equity here in the US for Filipino Americans in STEM, we have a fireside chat with the Association of Filipino Scientists in America, or AFSA, to be led by 2 PhD students, one from Florida International University, Lowell Ipora, and another from Columbia University, Carla Bertulfo. They'll be talking about, their experiences being graduate students in STEM in the US and their prospects for their professional careers in the science, also in the United States. And please don't forget, as you can see on my background, the 2022 PAASE Annual Meeting and Symposium, or APAMS, will be held on October 11th through 14th, 2022. And this is sponsored by the University of Santo Tomas. This is fully virtual, and the registration is still open. The abstract submissions are already closed. But please join us, participate, and check our website, paase.org, for details. Maraming salamat po, and please enjoy the webinar, and please engage, ask good questions, or any question is important. So good night, and maraming salamat.
Thank you so much for that, Mario. So now let's introduce our speaker. So let me just share my screen. So today we'll discuss about engineering sustainable food production. Our speaker is Professor Raymond Tan. So this webinar talks about feeding the world's growing population, since it continues to be a challenge as it is further compounded by environmental problems such as climate change and plastic pollution. Systems engineering computing techniques have the potential to plan intensive food production, considering criteria such as productivity, resource efficiency, and robustness. This talk discusses the use of process graph methodology to design productive and robust co-culture farms based on a recently published paper in Nature Sustainability. General implications of a systems engineering approach to enhancing global food security will be examined. So I invite everyone to ask questions at the end of the talk, since this is a topic that is of concern to everyone. Our speaker is a distinguished professor and a university fellow, also the Vice President for Research and Innovation at De La Salle University, Manila. He has more than 500 publications, more than 11,000 citations, and a current H index of 53. He is also an academician of the National Academy of Science and Technology of the Philippines. He has received multiple scientific awards from the Department of Science and Technology, CHED, NASC, National Research Council of the Philippines, PhilASC, De La Salle Alumni Association, and of course, PAASE. He is also an editor-in-chief of the Process Integration and Optimization for Sustainability, which is published by Springer Nature, an associate editor of Sustainable Production and Consumption, Cleaner Engineering and Technology, which are both published by Elsevier. He also serves as the member of the editorial board for various scientific journals. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Tan.
Thank you very much, Dean Kay, to PASE President, Dr. Santo Domingo, my old friend and colleague, Dr. Al Sarafica, colleagues from the Philippines, from the United States, and other parts of the world. It's my pleasure to be giving this webinar for you this morning. And as we begin the new academic year, depending on or regardless of which country you're in, I think it's good that we begin with pushing the boundaries of science. So if you'll allow me to share my screen. The talk is entitled Engineering Sustainable Food Production. And I would have to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators in this work, our MC, Dr. Kay Aviso, a colleague who's currently a professor at the University of Miskolc in Hungary, but was until a few years ago actually affiliated with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And another PASE member, Dr. Angeline Lau, who's with our Department of Mathematics and Statistics. This is a photograph of our research team in one of our Zoom meetings, I believe almost exactly a year ago. And I'll begin my talk with this brief quote from a report published by IPCC earlier this year. Words that foreshadow a potentially grim future for humanity. Climate change will increasingly put pressure on food production. And this is really the main gist of my talk, the nexus of two major sustainability issues. The talk is organized into 4 parts, and I'll begin with a discussion of vicious cycles and networks, and we'll proceed from there. And I'll begin by discussing SDG number 2, which is zero hunger. The second United Nations SDG aims to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. These are lofty goals, of course, but in the end, these solutions need to be implemented in the fields, literally, with the help of science and technology. The global scale of the problem can be seen from a rather Malthusian lens. And no matter how we look at it, we have a planet of fixed size and we have a constantly growing human population. So a very influential paper published in 2010 discussed the implications of trying to provide enough food for 9 billion people. And a more recent paper published in 2020 now moved the finish line, or the vision towards feeding 10 billion within sustainable boundaries. And the more recent article came to the conclusion that it is possible, but it does require a major rethinking of global food production systems. Next, we shift gears and down the Sustainable Development Goals, we look at number 13, which is climate action, where we seek to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, or in the lingo used by researchers, climate change mitigation, which is all about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change adaptation, that is adjusting human activities to be able to cope with the changes that will inevitably occur because of historical greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is the impacts are already in play, and there's plenty of inertia in in the physical and chemical systems, and thus, even if we were to cut our greenhouse gas emissions immediately to zero, there would still be some momentum in that climate change, which would be felt for decades to come. So, for example, there are climatic impacts on ecosystems. If you were to look at marine ecosystems, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, and increasing acidification as excess CO2 dissolves in seawater. All will put pressure on ecosystems such as coral reefs and, of course, the higher trophic layers that subsist on these foundations of ecosystems. And these are such complex natural systems that it's very difficult to predict with confidence what the response will be. Now, if we look at food production, we have to keep in mind that food is primarily grown in farms, despite research nowadays, which aim to, for example, produce lab-grown meats. By and large, human food production is still based on farming. And farms, of course, are open systems. There are actually embedded ecosystems in any farm or plantation that you visit. Many of these are invisible or would not be typically top of mind to an observer. But the productivity and robustness of farming really depends on not just the crops being harvested, but the various organisms that are also present as part of a symbiotic system. So food production is eventually going to be limited by land, water availability, nutrient footprint. So we need to supply, for example, nitrogen to supplement the natural nitrogen cycle, phosphorus also as a nutrient, and other nutrients. At the same time, of course, we have to contend with climate change impacts. For instance, changing levels of rainfall or changing ambient temperatures might make crops which are currently suitable for a particular location unsuitable at some point in the future. And then, of course, we'll look at some of the more downstream oriented problems in logistics, human resources. It's often noted in the Philippines, for instance, that there's a human resource crunch in the agriculture sector, with the average worker approaching senior citizen in age. And finally, the main topic of this talk are the network effects that occur in agricultural systems, where very often counterintuitive impacts may arise from any of the above factors, which are very hard to predict. Just to drive home the point, let's look at this network model of marine ecosystems. This was published about a year ago. And it's very interesting because certain kinds of whales in the seas feed on something called baleen, which baleen whales feed on plankton, rather. And you would think, just by a simple deduction, that a decline in whale population, in particular the baleen whales, would reduce the amount of organisms feeding on the plankton and would actually boost the plankton population as a result. But actual observations show the opposite. As whale populations decline, the plankton populations decline as well, which is completely different from what you would expect. But network models of ecosystems have actually elucidated exactly why this occurs. And you can read that paper to understand exactly what the causality mechanisms are. But the point is, sometimes the effects that we encounter are completely different from what you would expect from simple intuition. And this is where we use models to supplement the limitations of the human mind. These are sort of cognitive aids. And I'll talk about process graph models and our work on socio-ecological networks. This work is available online. This is an open access journal, so you can feel free to download this. And we actually did a webinar on this a couple of years ago, which should still be in the PAASE archives. But we'll go through the summary of this paper. The model that we developed is based on engineering models that were originally intended to help design industrial plants, where, for instance, in the schematic diagram on the screen, if we're producing a particular chemical from raw materials, you sort of do a jigsaw puzzle approach and take individual components and assemble them into the best design that you can come up with in terms of profit criteria. So computer aids can enable the design of such plants and improve performance. One of the techniques that we consider is known as process graph, which was developed jointly by Ferenc Friedler, who's still an active researcher based in Hungary, and the late Professor L.T. Fan, who's based in Kansas in the United States at the time that the work was done. And they developed graph theoretic algorithms to automate part of the industrial plant design process. What we did in 2020, actually the work began in 2019, a few months before the pandemic, was to adapt this algorithmic approach to the analysis of ecosystems from the perspective of a human population that relies on such ecosystems to meet their needs. And this is what was documented in that paper that I showed earlier. And the approach simply represents the components or the species that make up an ecosystem by nodes in a graph model, as you would see on the right side of our screen. The capabilities of this approach include the assembly of fragmented information about ecosystems into a coherent picture. That's a very important point to make because zoologists and botanists understand typically the specific organisms that they specialize on, and perhaps those in immediate proximity or interaction. But there needs to be a way to assemble the scientific expertise regarding individual organisms into a complete map of how these organisms, perhaps dozens or even hundreds of them, interact in an actual ecosystem. And sometimes there isn't enough expertise at that level of understanding how the whole system works. The model enables enumeration of viable ecosystems, and that's very important from an ecosystem management standpoint. What happens when you remove particular components of an ecosystem? And here by remove, I mean, what if you disrupt or reduce the biomass sufficiently to cause a species to become vulnerable or endangered? How does that affect the rest of the ecological network? And in our approach, we are able to model different types of network linkages, not just trophic linkages or what eats what, but linkages that include pollination or mutualism and other kinds of interactions among organisms. We model dietary flexibility, which of course is a natural reaction for many predators and organisms. If their main food source declines in availability, typically there is the option for them to be able to shift to other sources of food to different degrees. And based on these models, we're able to identify limiting states of the ecosystem. So we could simulate what happens when we push a given baseline ecosystem to the brink by removing different components, and then figure out essentially the breaking point. At what point does an ecosystem collapse? Theoretically, that is within an in vitro environment or in silico environment rather. So here's how we represent organisms within a process graph model. So each one of these is an organism, and what we can see, if we zoom in on the right side, we have a herbivore, and the nodes above it represent what it needs, not just by way of food, but for example, it needs a habitat as well. And the nodes underneath this particular organism signify what it contributes to the rest of the ecosystem. Also by way of food, when it becomes nutrition or nutrients for the carnivore, or a source of food for humans, for example. And when this herbivore dies, or during its normal life as well, it creates detritus, which contributes to the ecosystem. So every component of the ecosystem is mapped this way, and we're able to automate the linking of these components into a map as shown here. Now, this is a stylized ecosystem that was meant to demonstrate the algorithms, but of course, in principle, that can be applied to any system of arbitrary size, provided that the input data is available. And what we can then do is simulate the effect of removing particular components of the ecosystem So we start with what is known as the maximal structure on the left side, and a reduced structure, which is pushed to the brink, but still marginally viable. In other words, this is at the point of collapse, but it does show us the limiting state of this original ecosystem. And that creates plenty of opportunities for using these algorithms in ecosystem management. Now, what we did much more recently, starting about December of 2021, is to look at this modeling approach and apply it to the problem of agriculture. And this is a paper which was published much more recently. This is not open access. You can reach the abstract via this QR code, but you can send me an email if you're interested in reading further, and we can send you we can actually share the PDF file, the supporting information, and the actual model code is freely available. Now, because one of the major crops in the Philippines, and in fact the rest of Asia, is rice, we thought it would be good to look at rice farming as our major point of concern. And as many of you would know, rice paddies look something like what you would see on screen, whether this happens to be in the Philippines or Vietnam or China or elsewhere. Generally, what you do is you create a shallow pond where the rice is grown, and that actually creates plenty of underutilized opportunity to grow other organisms in this semi-aquatic environment. So for instance, you could grow various invertebrates like shrimp or freshwater invertebrates. At the same time, you could grow vertebrates like ducks and such, without incurring incremental land footprint. And if you consider, for instance, the case of the Philippines, of how to feed 110 million people with 300,000 square kilometers of area, of which only a small fraction is for agriculture, with a growing population and a land area that is more or less fixed, how do you sustain that kind of the requirement of such a growing population? One of the ways to do this is to intensify agriculture. That means we find ways to integrate activities that would normally occupy different tracts of land. But we also have to understand the potential pitfalls of doing so. So this is where network models come into play. And just as we would design an industrial plant with these algorithms, taking chemical reactors and distillation columns and such, and in silico, assembling them into a production system that is viable and profitable, we can apply very similar principles to taking different organisms that exist within a typical rice paddy, as well as a target organism for additional value in the rice farm. We can assemble these into a picture of the ecosystem that actually exists in the rice farms. And there's work done by a group of researchers in China, Dong and colleagues, in 2021, published an ecological network model analysis of harvesting crayfish in rice paddies. And they noted in their paper that there are a host of different organisms that actually interact, as shown in this cartoon on the screen. What is not shown in the initial diagram is that, of course, all these organisms, either through excretion or through death, would then contribute to a pool of detritus that is also present in the rice farms. So what we did was we took the data that they reported and translated those into a process graph model, which you would see here. Now, Dong and colleagues basically did a descriptive modeling exercise. And what that means is they took a snapshot, in effect, of a typical rice farm in China and gave a description of the interactions among the different organisms present. What we're trying to do is apply a more normative approach, figure out what can be done with that kind of population balance of different organisms. And the baseline is given by this process graph model, which shows all of the major organisms that are present. Rice, obviously, is what we're trying to grow as a primary crop, And the amount of rice produced, given the assumption of constant yield or productivity, is a proxy for the land area. And what we're trying to do, bear in mind, is we're trying to produce as much food as possible, given a fixed land area. The secondary crop that we're trying to introduce is the crayfish, which of course provides, eventually that'll be, you would eat that as you would eat prawn or shrimp or lobster. So you could use that you could saute that in garlic or what have you. But the point is that is potentially something you could grow in the pond-like environment of rice paddies. But as we've seen, we also have a host of other organisms that contribute to the food web that actually exists within a farming environment. So what we can do is not just describe what's present, but we could figure out what's the optimal yield or productivity that we can squeeze out of this system. And we can actually enumerate the first solution, the second best, third best, and so on. So by optimizing, we're able to come up with normative benchmarks for farming, and I'll discuss more of that later. But this is the optimal solution which we arrived at in silico, which shows that out of 60 potential networks, which we know as, or we refer to as near optimal networks, this is the optimal solution that we can get. And potentially we can squeeze out as much as 1.2 kilograms of crayfish harvest per kilogram of rice with just 5 species present. This again is an optimum, so it's a limiting state, and it would be actually impossible to achieve this in real life, but you could push your farming system as close as possible to this limiting state by controlling the presence of the other organisms in the farm. The important point to make is generally for ecosystems, sparse networks signify lack of robustness, and we would like something that's very branched and very high entropy from a thermodynamic standpoint for it to be robust to various disruptions. So we would then explore, this is very sparse, and this is probably going to be prone to collapse in case of drought or climate change. So how do we make our farm both optimally productive and robust? Well, we can then explore using the process graph model near optimal solutions. And let's take, for example, the second best solution, which we would see here. And as we can see, we have a higher degree of branchedness in this ecological network. In other words, more species are present, which is more realistic because it's actually going to be difficult to create a sterile environment with just 5 organisms in an open field. But what we can see here is that this solution, even though mathematically it's not optimal, is only 0.4% worse than the previous one that we saw. So that is still from a field standpoint, or from a practical standpoint, that is still very much practically an optimal solution. Next, let's have a look at the third best solution. We can see here that it's slightly worse than the second best, but not enough to be even worth mentioning. But this is even more branched and thus more robust. And yet its performance is practically equivalent to the nominal mathematical optimal solution. And we have 60 such solutions that were generated from our model as we report in our paper. We're not going to go through all of those, but we're going to see the trend. And the key lesson is if we track all 60 networks that we were able to optimize with these algorithms, we note that we have a sort of a staircase structure when we plot the yield relative to rank. And that means that we have families of structures, of ecosystem structures, with very similar yield levels across these performance plateaus, which is good because that allows a farmer to design or plan the practices in farming to be able to land in any one of these plateaus and thus come up with a relatively stable solution. The other key takeaway is because of the staircase structure, we observe step changes that occur between the plateaus, which are rather, you should think of these as warnings. These are the features that you would like to avoid to prevent that drop off in performance between plateaus. Now, what are the implications for sustainable farming? As we said, we can squeeze out more nutrition from a given land area through co-culture, but that needs to be studied. The solutions provide normative benchmarks for farming practices. Co-culture is not completely new. It's being done in other countries, probably being done in parts of the Philippines as well already. But in addition to field observations, I think the models provide very good insights on the limiting levels of productivity that you could aim for when you actually apply this in the field. The near optimal solutions can be used to identify robust solutions. These are the highly branched networks, which are still very close to the maximum in terms of productivity. And of course, model results are always to be taken with a grain of salt. So the final point here is, because it takes such a long time to run an agronomic field test for sustainable farming, that takes months to set up the farm and then to actually do the measurements at the end of the harvest season. So what we also propose in our work is that we can use these models to help streamline the planning and the execution of agronomic field studies, which would economize on various R&D resources that we invest for our food security. Now, the approach, even though we apply it here to co-culture farming, just a bit of imagination can point to potential applications in food production. So for example, we have started to work with two colleagues from our Department of Biology on ecologically engineered plantations. And by plantations, we can think of food products, but we can also consider non-food products like fiber production, like for cotton and such. We're starting to look at invasive species management and biological control as well via network models. And the point, again, is to use the network models to be able to identify potential risks from unintended consequences of the introduction of either invasive species or biological pest control organisms. There is plenty of, I think, plenty of opportunity to apply these computing techniques to integrated vertical and urban farming systems. In fact, a team from Hungary just recently published a paper on this, optimizing vertical farming systems. And if you were to dream a bit more in the blue sky direction, these techniques can be applied to designing life support systems for space stations and for long-term space travel, where you have to design an ecosystem that fits inside the spacecraft so that it becomes self-sustaining and closed loop at that. Okay, I'll now proceed to my conclusions. And there are three simple points to make. Number one is we have developed a process graph modeling technique for ecological networks. And these are networks that are not just in natural ecosystems, but ecosystems that exist in man-made environments like farms. And because of such general applicability, these models can be used to engineer more sustainable, more resource-efficient food production systems. And finally, again, taking simulations with a grain of salt, we can use these to streamline the planning and the execution of actual agronomic field studies. So let me just conclude by thanking some colleagues, including the father of the PGRAPH algorithms, Ferenc Friedler from Hungary and his team. Special thanks to the tech team, Dr. Boton Bertok, and the PGRAPH Studio team that develop and make the software available for users all over the world. And two entomologist colleagues that we've started to work with were exploring insects in farms and plantations as the current point of interest. All right, that concludes my talk. Take a snapshot if you want my contact details. But right now, I would be very happy to engage you in a discussion. Thanks once again for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Raymond. The floor is now open for any questions. So if you have any questions, I invite the audience to kindly type in the chat box or kindly raise your hand so that I can unmute you and you can address your question directly. Okay, so Al, yeah, you can take the first question.
Good work, Raymond. I mean, I like the approach that you've taken. It reminds me of my good old chemical engineering unit operations and process control boxes, leading to a more complex ecosystem approach indeed. I was at the National Academy Food Production meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, where they discussed the use of insects and potentially other food sources as protein substitutes for higher animals as feeds. I'm wondering what would be the best test for your model in terms of optimizing a particular existing process right now, more along the lines of this situation that we're in terms of a shortage in NPK fertilizers, the use availability of biofertilizers on one side, and then producing it somewhere along the whole ecosystem approach where you use the biofertilizers to make more protein masses, maybe from insects, thereby creating more meals for aquatic, higher productivity for fish for human consumption. So I'm thinking along those lines, and having seen what you just presented, where would I apply it and show real improvement very quickly by saying that by inputting enough of this, you will end up having a more efficient process over here and ended up having a higher productivity there. Thereby your harvest in the aquatic resources will be increased by twofold. So I'm thinking along those multi-faceted approach that you presented, and given that background that I just had, I said that might work. And except that I was just in Los Baños yesterday, and they were presenting their agricultural food nutrition science portfolio. There's about 100 research projects that were completed with Leo Fernando's college there. And I was thinking along those lines about an interaction with between your team and the UP system type approach, and both Visayas on aquaculture and on because they're the ones doing the field indeed. And if you can indeed help them not only make their field testing less laborious and more efficient, but even more directed, in my view. Because I was just with the Israel ambassador of last 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about our trip to Israel, about seeing their bananas in the desert and their innovations in Technion. It all comes to me, to a real challenge on how to be able to model and demonstrate effectiveness. And this model that you've developed indeed can definitely help. It's just a matter of where do we want to have the, for lack of a better word, my startup proof of concept. How do we make a minimum viable product out of this that has been shown to be a good correlation with what's happening on the field? I know it's a big question to have, but I think you've touched on almost all of those. But I would love to hear where you would want, if you're given a magic wand to assemble a transdisciplinary team, where would you put it, and who will be the players in that team? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Al. Thanks for that question. And let me just go backwards through it. I think one of the lessons we learned earlier this year is that we need to start working with the actual biologists and agricultural specialists to make sense of this, and which is why we started working with our two best entomologists in our university. But we're actually, I'm speaking on behalf of the core team, we're very happy to share these techniques with collaborators from anywhere in the world. Of course, the only constraint for us would be time and effort. Now, let me explain how the model can be used in general terms. The modeling approach is based on the, okay, I actually had a slide on this. If you remember the old legend of the blind men and the elephant, where one blind man touches the trunk and says, oh, an elephant looks like a snake and such. If the blind men had some way of linking their minds together algorithmically, they could have developed a nice mental picture of what the elephant really looks like, rather than to have a notion based on their local perspectives. And like it or not, the way science is done basically is people specialize. So for instance, if I'm a specialist in the coconut tree, I understand the tree itself, its biology. I probably have a strong understanding of organisms that are in direct interaction with the coconut tree, the pollinators, the pests, and such. But the more steps I remove an organism from direct contact with the coconut tree, the less I'm likely to have a full understanding of the impact. So if you go 2 steps removed or 3 steps or 10 steps removed, that becomes really beyond the capability of the human mind, no matter how well trained. So models really can be viewed as cognitive aids, basically to enhance what the human mind is able to do. And I'll conclude my response with a basic analogy. If, for instance, we're trying to design alternative food production systems, say using worms or using other non-conventional invertebrates as animal feeds, or even as human food, the key there is the proponents that would be proposing earthworms, for instance, would have a very good understanding of the earthworms, but they need to link that knowledge with the knowledge of somebody else. And the way I would frame this modeling approach is imagine an integrated food production system as a jigsaw puzzle. And what you have are all of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle with an added complication. Unlike a conventional jigsaw puzzle, what if the pieces could fit into each other in more ways than one? So that combinatorially, that increases the level of complexity of the problem, because it's not just elimination. There are many ways to link them together. So what we have, thanks to Friedler and colleagues, is a set of algorithms that will do that for us, provided we know how to frame each of those pieces in the language of the graph theoretic model. We can just use the algorithms to assemble them into every possible candidate food production system or farm that you could imagine. And again, these are not to be taken purely at face value, but they can definitely streamline field tests and economize. If you're working on a limited DOSD budget, you obviously want to squeeze the most scientific results out of limited resources. So I think that's where we can contribute. And this is my first presentation on this particular topic. So I think any one of the 4 members of the core team, sorry to volunteer them like this, but I think we'd be happy to take this on a roadshow and share it with colleagues from other institutions in the Philippines and the rest of the world. Pardon the long answer, but you know me.
That's perfect. Thank you. Actually, I'm just connecting it with what I'll be out to next week in Davao, CDO, and Coronadal and Gensan to look at the problems of the agriculture together with the industry. And I'm thinking about trying to fit your model in that that regards and how to increase their productivity and income. But I'm sure both Sean, Raimundo, and Menchie will probably be able to give you some field testing ideas. So I'm gonna shut up. Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Raimundo.
Yeah, I just read an article on microbes and climate change. And indeed, the conclusion is microbes are so important in environment, in methane production, gas production, everywhere. Yet they're not being factored in your models and in any climate change model. So what do you think? We've been pondering on having a webinar on the role of microbes in climate change. But if we can find the right speaker, they're all Americans. So what do you think, Dr. Tan?
Well, I think if there's an invitation somewhere in that question, as I said, either I or my colleagues would be happy to share at least our side of what we can contribute to the discussion. And as I explained to Al in the previous exchange, what we offer is the possibility of having biologists who have expertise in specific discrete components, or rather separate components of ecosystems, and assemble that knowledge into an ecosystem picture. I think that's what we stand to offer. And obviously, the domain experts focusing on specific microorganisms, whether these are in the soil or in water and such, I think there needs to be a way to take the specialists' knowledge and put that in a macro scale picture of how things interact. Because the problem with climate change is there will be many cascade effects. And we want to see those cascade effects before they actually happen in real life. By the time they happen in real life, it will probably be too late. So the key is, even if the models don't give exactly the right or exact or very precise simulations, if we have a sense of which directions we have to avoid before these events happen, I think that there is some value in that. But thank you for your question. And again, I for one would be happy to share through a webinar what I've just shared this morning.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, next would be Menchi.
Good morning, Dr. Tan. Very
Morning.
quickly, I was just going to share that one of the major applications from the late 1990s to 2000s is integrated agriculture, aquaculture. And in Southeast Asia, the main is rice fish, as well as in South Asia. So you have tilapia for Southeast Asia and carp for South Asia. So models like this, when you came out with the paper, I read it immediately, just looking into the BP graph algorithm. The currency for looking at the systems in integrated agriculture, there is a lot of data, if you go to these places, would be the optimization of income in farm households. So if you can draw the squares to just define define the boxes yourselves from what an IAA system is already set up with, then the currency for that will then be income. In fishery systems, for example, the currency is carbon energy. So looking into the energy inputs around the system and looking at where things go for fish catch, that's the other thing. So maybe, I think from our perspective, our current modeling is very much anchored in the output of a single value, which in your case was kilograms per rice production. And I would think that the validation of this model doesn't have to be very robust, as you were saying. But I would think that alternative options, let's say new gear or new systems, you can then come up with a suggestion of which innovation is best. And for the same thing for aquaculture, integrated agriculture, aquaculture systems, if you start going into intensive farming or vertical farming or something like that, how will that affect the model and come up with the income output at the end? And the other thing would also be disaster, as you were saying immediately. I think the melding of the very process-oriented engineering systems can be tweaked by things like seasonality, because rice and fish don't get harvested at the same time, and then you can also change the organisms that go into this. So I think the data is there. And it's just a matter of linking up with people in Southeast Asia and South Asia who have actually collected this kind of data over decades.
Well, thank you for that, Menchi. The main thing that came to mind as you were asking your question was, if you have a graduate student, at least master's or perhaps PhD, who's computationally inclined, we should sit down and have a discussion about this. Because I know that you have many, many years of experience in actual work with fish. And I actually failed to mention that in my talk, that you could use the paddies to grow tilapia and such. Now, in terms of if there is published data available, then it simply takes a hardworking grad student to make sense of that and turn that into a thesis and a bunch of papers. But at the same time, just to re-emphasize what we bring to the table, the bulk of the literature and models that are linked to biological systems are what are called descriptive models. And very often the approach is to take a snapshot or a virtual replica of an ecosystem and just do the descriptive analysis. But as a colleague of ours, I remember former PASE President Joe Cruz once said, the difference between engineering and science is about understanding things. Engineering is about intervening to make something happen. So that's what we bring to the table. We have an engineering model where if you know that you can farm tilapia and rice in a particular way because that way was determined by trial and error, we could potentially tinker with that without risking actual harvests. We could do it in silico and tinker with that and figure out, is there a better way to do it? And if we find that we have a reasonably robust computer-generated solution, then we could do directed tests and do it in the field to find out whether it actually works. So the engineering models provide us with the capability to intervene and actually tinker with the real world, while providing a bit of a safe environment to do it. But yeah, let's have, since we're in the new academic year, let's have a conversation about that.
Okay, great. Okay, now it's Al again.
I just want to
Then,
add, while we have Menchi, actually Menchi, this is an ideal, for me at least, model, and this is what I bring to the table. If you use Raymond's model or find its application in your crab and your metabolomics studies, I'll provide the land. I have a crab farm that we can use in Matabukay near the Lasal in Matungod. And we can do this on the field, guys. That's the kind of thing that I want to see, the marriage between the science and the engineering and in the field. So I'm excited, but I think they have CP and
Yeah, we have
people at the,
yeah, we have a few more questions on the chat
Thank you.
box. So let me
But,
just get
well,
to
take me
the
up for it.
Sorry, Kay,
Yeah,
can
okay.
I respond just very briefly?
Yeah,
I
sure,
promise to make
sure.
this brief. I heard a word ending in omics when Al spoke. One of our colleagues, one of the core members of the team, Dr. Angeline Lau, actually has come up with the idea which we need to flesh out on how to use the same algorithms, but for a completely different approach in omics, basically figuring out, for example, well, she spoke of drug interactions and how they interact with human metabolism and such. So potentially the same algorithms with a bit of imagination can be used not just for modeling ecosystems, but interactions of all the internal gears and machinery of organisms.
Okay, having said that, of the potential advantages and applications of this modeling technique, let me move on to the question of Ria. So what are the possible limitations on the other end of this particular approach?
Well, the limitations at the moment are that we're assuming it's, first of all, it's data intensive. And really, from a practical standpoint, that's why I mentioned the need for a graduate student to do it, because if we're trying to imagine a future food production system where you're using earthworms and insects and such, along with cows and pigs in an integrated farm, there needs to be someone digging up the data on these individual organisms, which would typically come from different journals, and basically assemble them into a form which you can then put into the model. So that is, it's going to be labor intensive, but actually worth, at the very least, a master's thesis, potentially PhD as well. Now, in terms of the other main limitation is because of its ancestry, the process graph algorithms always are linked to food production or production systems. The actual mathematical axioms that are used as the foundation of the algorithms require an output that is consumed by a customer or consumer, which would be humans. So for instance, in that case, the algorithms cannot be used for ecosystems as they exist in nature without an external consumer, if you will. So pristine ecosystems that exist without humans subsisting on the components cannot be modeled with this approach.
Okay, thanks for that. I have a couple of questions which are given anonymously. The first one is, was corporate cost or expenses incorporated in the PGraph application? And the second question is, when you talk about sustainability, does it equate to being affordable?
All right, good question. Thank you for that. Now, in the work that we've done, we've used either weight, for example, kilograms of crayfish, kilograms of rice, or in earlier work, we've used calories, which is a measure, of course, a proxy measure for food and nutritional value. That said, there are no mathematical restrictions to using cost or prices of the various products. That can be done provided that the data is there. But the problem with cost data is that is, of course, linked not just to the internal structure of the model, but linked to market forces outside of the farm system. So the price of rice, for example, would very much depend on things going on even outside of the Philippines. So that's the basic answer. You could potentially compute the profitability of that kind of a farming system for a given set of prices, which now, of course, that optimum might not be the same if something happens which shakes up the food markets and changes the price levels. But in principle, it can be done.
Okay, what about the second question in terms of equating sustainability with being affordable?
Oh, okay. Here we used sustainability from the perspective of land as a limiting resource, which again, if you look at the literature on global food sustainability, land is one of the major factors in addition to water and nutrients. So that is a limiting factor, but again, the mathematics would be applicable if we were using water resources or nutrient resources or some other resource as an input into the system.
Okay, thanks for that. The next question comes from CP. He's wondering if the models incorporated a scale component. Farmer income, for example, depends much on scale, and many solutions depend on scale simply because of fixed costs associated.
Great question. That's a great question. In this particular, that gives us an idea for the next paper, but in this particular case study that I showed, this is scale-free, but in practice, yes, economies of scale can actually be represented within the model simply by using different kinds of nodes for small farms, medium-sized farms, and such, and the cost functions would be different. So that can be done. In fact, we'll put that in our calendar of things to do in 2023 or sooner.
Okay, thank you for that. That's the last question. We do have a couple of comments in the chat, so kindly just respond, Dr. Tan, in the chat box. So with that, thank you everyone. So kindly give a round of applause to our speaker, but please don't leave yet. I have a few announcements. So that was a very interesting presentation. So let me just move on to our announcements. Let me just share this short video. Yes, I'd like to invite you to submit your articles to SciEng Journal. So let me just move on to the next slide. So I'd like to present the Certificate of Appreciation to our speaker, Dr. Raymond Tan, for graciously sharing his expertise in this talk entitled Engineering Sustainable Food Production during the PAASE webinar series organized by the Research Expertise Cluster Council, given the 16th day of September 2022, signed PAASE President, Dr. Mariano Santo Domingo. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
And
much. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And like what was mentioned earlier by Dr. Santo Domingo, so please join us in other future events. So the next webinar will be on First, Do No Harm, Food Safety Matters in Nutrition. This will be next week, September 23, again at 8 o'clock in the morning. Our speaker will be Dr. Cecilia Cristina Acuin. If you're interested, kindly register at bit.ly/3DADPJB or kindly scan the QR code, which you can find on this screen. So kindly do a screen capture so that you can register. And of course, we'd like to hear from you. Kindly evaluate this talk, and we'd like to know what other topics you'd want us to feature. Just click on the QR code once again, or go to bit.ly/evalpaase_sept. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and hope to see you next week in our talk. So have a great day, everyone.